In Northern California, there were 2 million acres of redwood when the European settlers first arrived, and we have managed in a century and a half to cut down 97% of the original cathedral-like redwood forest. So in a case like the Bohemian Grove, where there's something like 200 acres on the property of genuine old-growth redwood, it's an incredibly unusual situation. And the fact that the remainder of the forest on the 2,700-acre Bohemian Grove is mature second-growth redwood, already beginning to achieve characteristics of old-growth trees, makes it even more unusual. It's one of, in the world of environmental restoration, this would be considered one of the preeminent opportunities that exist. The environmental community is attempting to educate and convince the Bohemian Club that there are other ways of looking at managing this property than as a source of revenue from logging receipts. We think that the Bohemian Grove property is every bit as distinctive and unique as, for example, Muir Woods. Now, if there were a proposal to log Muir Woods, the public would be up in arms. The Bohemian Club is private, the public isn't allowed into it, so obviously it doesn't have quite the same resonance. But from an ecological point of view, the Bohemian Grove has 2 streams that flow right into the Russian River. The whole watersheds of those tributaries are under the ownership of the club. There's opportunities for fishery restoration. There are endangered species, marbled murrelet, northern spotted owl. There are osprey, there are golden and bald eagles sighted on the Grove. It's a very special property, and so we're trying to get the club to think of it more as from an ecological point of view rather than from a commercial revenue point of view. I'm not sure how well we've succeeded, but that's the thrust of our vision for the place. The fishery of the Russian River was once one of the more abundant in California. Millions of coho salmon, king salmon, and steelhead spawned in the Russian River, and over time, because of land fragmentation, because of urbanization, because of poor agricultural practices, and of course poor logging practices, the water quality and the fishery and the spawning beds of the Russian River have declined tragically. Now there's a real effort, particularly among environmentalists in the lower Russian River, who view the restoration of the salmon and steelhead fishery in the river. The key part of the river is really that lower 8 or 10 miles. So the Bohemian Club is right there, and it's one of the largest, relatively, even though there's been this sad 20-year history of some commercial logging, it's still relatively pristine. It's a relatively large chunk of property. And so it could be, if the Bohemian Club came to see it that way, a very important building block where the Bohemian Club could be working with river restoration groups, with fishery restoration groups, and thinking in terms of habitat corridors. Now, this can all be done. It wouldn't mean the Bohemian Club would have to give up its privacy, wouldn't mean it would have to give up the activities it engages in which bring its members the enjoyment that they get out of the place. But it would put the Bohemian Club in a position of looking progressive and looking constructive, rather than, as is now the case, looking like a greedy absentee landowner with very little concern for the outside world. And it's too bad that that's happening, but it's something that could be changed. The Bohemian Grove was acquired by the Bohemian Club of San Francisco in segments, starting at the very end of the 19th century, around 1899 or 1900. Members of the Bohemian Club purchased some small portion of what is now 2,700 acres, and the purpose was to find a place for their annual summer retreat and theater and entertainment that has been going on now for almost a century and a half. But it was also to find a place that would provide a buffer from the cares of the world, a natural setting that would isolate and protect these members and their guests from the outer world. And over time, over a 50 or 60-year period, the club gradually cobbled together this magnificent piece of property. And it was very much viewed as something that was for recreational purposes, to be inspirational, and only in the last 20 years has kind of a new mentality come to dominate within the Bohemian Club, and now it's become a logging tract. The Bohemian Club, ever since it started logging the Grove in the mid-1980s, has said repeatedly to its members and anyone else who's interested that it needs to thin out the conifer stands, the Redwood and the Doug Fir, in order to lessen fire danger. Almost every expert that we have asked whether that's valid to says that that's completely contrary to science. In other words, redwoods are among the more fire-resistant trees. Older Doug fir are very fire-resistant too. And it's actually only when you open up those stands through logging that the additional light that gets through to the ground encourages the proliferation of tan oak and bay trees and big leaf maple, ceanothus, all of those shrubby hardwoods that are much more fire prone. So, you know, at first blush, if you don't think about it very much, it sounds like, well, thinning out the trees is a good idea. But in this case, and the 20-year history of logging at the Grove has actually demonstrated that the club has more or less admitted in its management plan that the past 20 years of attempting to manage the Grove ostensibly for fire reduction purposes has failed. The other problem is, or another problem is, that in the course of the last 20 years of logging, the club has doubled the mileage of logging roads on the property. The property is much more fragmented than it used to be. One of the great hillside stands of old growth on the property, called the Bull Barn Old Growth Stand, has literally been cut in half by a logging road. So, and of course that's commonly understood, that logging roads can be almost as damaging as the logging itself. So we have the two working in a very destructive way together on this property. I've been trying to speak indirectly and directly to members of the Bohemian Club. I spoke to the board of directors and the appropriate committees and the Grove leadership in presentations I gave to them when I was a member, on one-on-one meetings with members of the board of directors, lunches and so forth. And I tried to say then what I'm still trying to say, that this is too precious, special and unique a piece of property to be reduced to a logging tract, and that the reasons that they have put forward, particularly fire hazard reduction, for their efforts are not valid. They're scientifically invalid, and I have tried to get them to think of themselves not so much in terms of private landowners and they can do anything they damn well please, but more just that they're the stewards. They hold this land for their generation, and their sons who will be members, and their friends who they'd like to invite, and their progeny will hopefully hold the place forever. And it ought to be looked at as that kind of treasure. So I guess in a nutshell, I'm arguing for something that's much more like a park management regime rather than a timber management regime. There might be some small amount of timber harvesting involved, but it wouldn't, the whole process and the whole planning, the whole discussion wouldn't be driven by timber harvesting levels. How many board feet should we take out next year? But by ecological considerations. How can we restore Smith Creek to a salmonid and steelhead fishery? How can we create corridors between the islands of true old growth so that we're beginning to get corridors for animals and birds to move through on the property? There's huge and very exciting opportunities. What roads can be decommissioned? There are many roads on that property. So there's all kinds of very exciting opportunities that could be brought to bear on the property. And it's just a matter of convincing the membership and the leadership that this opportunity is there for them to take advantage of.